Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've got a really interesting gentleman, Jonathan Diamond, to introduce you to tonight. He's a principal at Well Grounded Real Estate. He's the vice president of finance and acquisitions. He's got a really interesting background that we might delve into later on, because he's actually also got a PhD in neuroscience and a master of science and a master's in kinesiology. So kinesiology, neuroscience, and now real estate. Sounds kind of interesting. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
My pleasure. So you're specifically interested in apartments and rental, is that correct?
That's correct.
Why is that?
So it's a family business. So we've been in business since the 1950s. We've always had a focus of long-term rental access, long-term rental assets. Our portfolio is a mix between commercial retail and multifamily apartment buildings. And so our business model is long-term assets, rentals at our core, and this is what we do.
And in the Greater Toronto Area primarily?
Yeah, Southern Ontario.
Yeah. And you wrote last week in the Globe and Mail about the high development costs and the impact on delivering affordable rental units. Tell me about that article and your argument, please.
Sure, thank you. So, I think a lot of people that are sort of in the real estate industry, and even those who just follow it along, understand that there's a huge deficit of rental apartments in the city of Toronto. So you had this huge sort of boom in the 1950s and 1960s, sort of post-war apartment boom. These are all the old sort of brick buildings you see scattered throughout the city. And then around the 70s, we started producing condominiums and not much rental after that. Um, Now, this has led to a huge deficit and increased prices as a result. And one of the major factors for that, at least now when we're trying to catch up, is that the economics of apartments are such that you need an outsized amount of equity to make these projects economically feasible. So what this means is that the apartment buildings that you do see get built are built in areas that command high rents. And so what I argued in the piece is that it's not just a question of increasing supply, but if we can reduce cost such that you can build in lower rent areas, this will yield affordability today.
So you're talking about a high equity check. That's if you don't have CMHC financing. Is that correct?
That's with CMHC financing.
You still need a high equity check. I thought that they lever up very, very highly.
So what they'll tell you is that you can borrow up to 95% of the project costs, but what they don't tell you is that you actually never reach that threshold, because what you're permitted to borrow will be the lesser of 95% of the project cost. This is with respect to a particular CMHC program, or some sort of debt service coverage threshold. And that's the threshold that you always hit. So in theory, yes, you could borrow up to 95% of the project cost, but in reality, you rarely hit this because you're limited by the debt carrying capacity of an apartment building.
And to get the debt carrying capacity higher, you need higher rents.
Precisely.
Hmm. Now, they also have requirements on percentage of affordability, and some other requirements to get the financing, and that probably hits the debt service coverage.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So there's a lot of different CMHC programs. Some do require a certain amount of affordable housing. Until recently, with respect to the MLI Select loan, which is the most popular loan, you could get it sort of works on a point system. So you could actually get the maximum amount of points just on energy efficiency alone. But that has since changed as of a few weeks ago. So yes, in a lot of loans, affordability is a significant component.
Okay, well, let's talk about the energy efficiency. What do you need to get that energy efficiency? Does it increase your costs?
So I pause because yes and no. So what I like about the apartment business is that it's a long-term outlook. So if you're lowering your costs, you're actually lowering your expenses. So what we care about as apartment builders is sort of the long-term operational efficiency of these buildings. And so if you actually have a building that's operated more efficiently, you're using less energy. Your tenants are paying lower utility bills. And that sort of works out for everybody. The trick is, can you design a building such that you yield those operational efficiencies at an efficient cost?
Okay. So you're saying that development fees were the biggest culprit in the increased cost. Tell me about that.
So So when I talk about sort of project costs, that's sort of everything from the cost of construction to borrowing to the soft costs in terms of yeah, the various consultants and engineers and all of these sorts of things. But there's also a layer of municipal fees and governmental fees, which would be things like development charges, which are, could be about, depends on sort of what you're building, but about $40,000 per unit. We have things like community benefit packages, community benefit contributions, which is about 4% of land cost. You have separate school board education costs. The list goes on and on and on. And so all these fees can add up to approximately 10% of the total cost of the project. And so what we argue is that the private industry has an incentive and a role and a responsibility to innovate, to increase quality and to decrease costs. But we also see the other half of the equation is the government to reduce as much as possible the fees that are levied on developers that make these buildings near impossible to build in these lower rent markets that I alluded to previously.
I'm surprised you're saying it's only 10%. I've heard numbers significantly higher than that. Do you think it's higher than the 10%, or you think that's the right estimate?
It could be. So with respect to development charges and a couple of the big ones, but these are specifically sort of taxes that I'm referring to. So until the recent removal of GST, HST, that was a huge policy change that was really advantageous to building. One of the few big ticket items that have actually been made. But we're not talking about the soft costs or anything like that, just sort of fees and taxes specifically.
Okay. So do you think if cities reduced or eliminated development charges, particularly in more affordable areas, you would have an uptick in apartment construction?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is what we argue at our firm. So we argue that, it's not just a question of reducing fees to sort of increase profitability, but is to allow for profitable and sustainable business models in lower rent areas. So right now, if we use an analogy with cars, all we're building is BMWs, Mercedes. And if you look around, you say, wow, cars are really expensive. But there's this whole other market that would purchase Honda Civics and Mazdas and Nissans and all of these sorts of vehicles that is completely untapped. And so lowering the fees levied by governments, and if the private sector can improve sort of design and delivery methodologies to reduce that cost, you can have viable mid-market apartment construction, which is something that we're really working on.
I've heard some politicians say if they reduce development fees, it's a gift of windfall profits to developers.
I mean, it could be in some projects, but what I always argue is that's not what we care about. Is what we care about is increasing the number of areas that can sustain these types of construction. And so by reducing these costs, by eliminating development charges, for example, would open up a whole realm of geographies and markets that could support this type of construction. It's a really big deal.
I agree with you completely. I think that the outrageously high development charges and that differ so dramatically between different municipalities prove that they're not for what they say they are, which is needed costs for growth. And I've had pointed out by a couple of economists the ludicrousy of development charges in the Ottawa area, where the city of Ottawa, where the infrastructure costs are the lowest, has the highest development charges, and neighboring cities and towns outside of Greater Ottawa have the lowest development charges, where the infrastructure costs are the greatest. And so it ends up being just I think, a tax grab. And I think it's a complete mistake. And I think you're right that with that tax grab ends up becoming, a negative economic drain and drag on the type of product that you're trying to build. We're going to take a break and come back with Jonathan in just 2 minutes. And we're going to delve into why these apartments haven't been built over the course of the last couple of decades. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We've been focused on the real estate business this week, and we've had someone come in and talk about condo crash, and someone else talk about the reality of assignment sales and condos and debt, and she suggested a coming tsunami of problems in the condo market, mainly because the cost of carry is negative. That a lot of these investors bought condos so they could rent them out. But yet, right now, with high interest rates and the fact that they're sort of underwater on the equity, that the rents aren't covering it. And today, I wanted to focus on the apartment business because that's obviously the next segment of the real estate business. And our guest is an expert in that area. His name is Jonathan Diamond. He's a principal at an organization called Well Grounded Real Estate, and you're the head of finance and the head of acquisitions. So you said it was a family business. Well Grounded Real Estate sounds like an interesting name. How'd you get the name?
Yeah, so this is actually my father and our aunt. So we actually had a corporation that was for one of our properties that was called Well Grounded, and when we sort of became a little bit more, I guess, in the we needed more of sort of a brand. They liked the sound of that, and sort of the name stuck. So,
Excellent. And how'd you get into the business after a background in neuroscience and kinesiology?
yeah. So I got in the business. It was actually during my PhD. This was at Queen's, and my brother, who I work with, had already been working in the business for I think 4 or 5 years at that point. I was getting involved in some smaller business during my academics, and was sort of calling him and asking what the business is like, and one thing led to the other. I sort of tested out, and over the last 10 years, I've sort of found my niche.
So you left the world of neuroscience behind, or do you still study what people are all about from a psychological standpoint as you're selling them some apartments?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I mean, I still love science. I think, a vibrant, scientific enterprise is super important. I'd like to think some of that sort of carried over, especially in some of the development work that we're working through.
So you were saying that, back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, we had a vibrant apartment building business. And then we didn't. And if you take a look at the statistics that CMHC and other people publish, the biggest change in the construction of housing in Canada has been the drop in purpose-built rental. It's amazing when you look at the statistics. Single-family homes are about the same. One would have thought with population increases, GDP increases, et cetera, single-family home construction would go up, but it hasn't. It's sort of been flat for the last, 60 years, frankly, maybe 40 years. And condos have shot up in construction, but but purpose-built rental is dovin, whatever the right word is. And it's down to, very low levels, though some people think it's now going to come back up because of what's happened with the condo business. Why do you think that's happened?
Well, so I'll talk about sort of the 70s, then I'll talk about now. So I mean, rent control was a huge thing. Rent control sort of crushed supply. So rent control, we sort of have a hybrid model here in Ontario. So units that turn over will sort of move to market, but once you have a unit, then you're subject to the guideline increase, which is around 2% annually. So that sort of crushed supply when those policies emerged, and you see that in our units. So we have people for the exact same product that are paying $1,000 a month, and we have people that are right next door leasing the exact same product as their neighbor, and they're paying $2,200 a month. And so what ends up happening is that the small um, number of units that are turning over are effectively subsidizing the units that have been subject to rent control. And there's also a double whammy for the consumer, because what ends up happening is that it's now harder and harder to move, because your rent now is probably $1,000 more than what they're currently paying. So it makes moving really, really difficult. So that's sort of one reason why rents have gotten so expensive. And this is also sort of simultaneously, I think, why the industry moved to condominium development. Now, this is also sort of part and parcel with different ways that these two products are financed. So right now, condos are much more easy to finance because, well, effectively, they make revenue off the sale of the units. And so the sale of the units actually allows the condo developer to be paid back. They also have a bunch of pre-sales and things like deferred costs, which help with their capital stack. And when they sell the units, that money can be sort of redeployed in the marketplace. The apartment developer, assuming the apartment developer will then own and operate the asset into the future, doesn't have that exit. And so to pay back their construction loan, they actually take that construction loan out by way of long-term financing, which would be standard sort of 5 or 10 year loan that's amortized over, between 25 and 50 years now. Um, and that loan is limited by the cash flow. And sort of as I mentioned earlier, because you never actually hit those sort of high loan to value thresholds, it costs way more capital. It requires way more capital for the apartment developer to deliver an apartment building than a condo developer delivering the exact same product, but sort of to sell the units as a condo.
That is, if all those people that are supposed to show up on occupancy, they actually show up with the checks they're supposed to show up with, and that's one of the challenges in today's marketplace.
Sure. Yeah.
I heard, one person comment that the problem with condos is it's sort of like Christmas. You're selling all of your product on one day. And if you hit it right, you can make a big score. But if you hit it wrong and you're timing the market poorly, it ends up being a problem. In the rental market, you can sort of average in the good markets and the bad markets. What do you think of that?
Yeah, it's an interesting comparison. I mean, we don't deal in the condo world directly, so I can only speak from, you know, overlapping circles, let's say. But it is interesting that, a condo developer is sort of selling in this market and building in that market. Whereas the apartment developer is sort of doing the inverse, right? They're building in this market and selling, i.e., leasing, sort of in the future, which works to their benefit, assuming rents are sort of continuing to increase or at least stay stable. So I think in some sense that is true. It takes about a year to lease up a building, somewhere between say 6 months and 12 months. And plus you're also like releasing those units when people when people turn over. So yeah, I think there's some truth to that.
I heard that in addition to rent control, taking away accelerated depreciation was a big negative. Is that an issue?
A negative? Oh,
Uh,
sorry, taking
The,
away.
the governments took away accelerated depreciation for apartment buildings back in the 70s.
Yeah, so well, they've just added that back in. I think it's at 10% right now as of a few months ago. So as opposed to I think four is what the CRA says. I believe. Don't quote me on those, but I think they did reinstate that fairly recently. What's interesting about that policy is depending on where you have an asset held, that may or may not matter. So, for example, if you have an asset that you're building within a corporation that owns a bunch of other assets, and you actually have some net revenue to be offset by the increased rate of depreciation, um, it's advantageous. However, in most cases, people will open up separate corporations in order to de-risk when they're developing a new project. And in that case, and in the case with our project on Victoria Park, the increased rate of depreciation actually wouldn't add anything because the only revenue within that corporation is the revenue from the building, and the current rate of about 4% is sufficient to offset that revenue anyway for years to come.
Okay, so you're not going to gain any benefit from it. Tell us a little bit about your project. So you said you got one in Victoria Park?
Yeah, so we have sort of two projects right now. Our big one is 1925 Victoria Park. It's designed as a mid-market rental building. It's a really unique project in that it is mostly prefabricated, and we're using this as sort of phase one of a larger strategy to figure out how to innovate better models for design delivery through our design partners, Sarotny Group.
How do you do it prefabricated? Do you like have a plant somewhere that manufactures everything?
Yeah, so this particular building system came out of Austria. It's a building system called the Cree building system, and it's effectively consists of horizontal and vertical elements that are prefabricated in a precast concrete facility. And so what's really interesting about this system is that you actually don't need specialized facilities to manufacture the panels. You can actually go to market, and there's these precast concrete companies sort of sprinkled all throughout the world. And so what you can do is you can sort of tender the construction of these panels to a location that is near your site.
You won an award with the Holcomb Foundation for Sustainable Construction based on this. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. The Wholesome, yeah, Foundation. We that was last fall, and our project actually came in first for North America, which was a exciting honor.
And you were quoted as saying that you want to disprove the notion that sustainability is expensive and fancy. So what we wanted to do is build as basic as possible. Explain that if you
Yes.
could.
Yeah, so sustainability is one of these. I mean, I think you have to define what sustainability is. So in our, because it's one of these sort of buzzwords that sort of warrants a definition. So what we think of it as is how do you effectively build faster, cheaper, better, and do so in an economical way, meaning you have to have a sort of a profitable business model. Otherwise, you can't actually deliver these projects. And so right now we have this idea that this is these are sort of like fancy luxury characteristics. But we think that through design improvements you can actually increase the quality, decrease the cost, partly through operational efficiencies that makes this actually a business case rather than sort of a check mark on some list that you have to abide by.
So if you do this sort of precast concrete in a manufactured environment and somewhat prefab, what does it do? Does it decrease the cost or the time to construct or both?
So both. So I think people get very focused on the system of construction, and they always ask sort of what are the hard costs? What are the hard costs? But what the key is to all of this, and this is something that Sarotny Group has really sort of spearheaded, is you have to have a system for design and development that leverages the system that you're developing. And so what tends to happen in the industry is people say, okay, well, people will design a building. They'll have an architect design a building. They'll take it through zoning. They'll take it through site plan. And then they'll say, okay, we want to do this in some sort of prefabricated system. And then they shop the market for a prefabricated system. But the problem is that they've already designed the building. And so what you have to do is you have to find the system first and design the building around that. And so from the start, the entire sort of execution, the way the panels get assembled, your supply chain, everything that's sort of like integrating this whole process in order to reduce costs. So it's not enough just to look at the system. It's not enough just to look at your development strategy, but these things have to be brought together in a cohesive and aligned way.
Have you done this before?
This is our first project.
What do you think the reduction in cost is going to be? Any idea in percentage terms?
So Victoria Park is a unique one because the topology is completely different. So we have a giant central courtyard with these open air exterior single loaded corridors. And so it's really, really hard to benchmark costs. We think this project will probably be comparable to traditional construction, which will be pretty remarkable given sort of the product that we're going to be delivering. In the future, we're trying to get, say between 10, 20% cheaper on hard costs, something like that.
10 and 20% cheaper. That's pretty good. I've heard many people say that the construction business or the construction industry is one of the only industries that hasn't really had a lot of technological advancement and innovation. We're still using and making homes and buildings the same way we did 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago.
100%. Yeah. I mean, if you look, I mean, the technology sector is maybe slightly unfair to compare to, but if you look at something like Moore's Law, where, processing power gets, halved and speed doubles every 4 years or whatever the exact law is that's been happening for decades now, we have no equivalent in the construction industry. And so, part of the reason was the models that we have to construct buildings are what's referred to as project-based models. So it's effectively like building a custom home where you're sort of starting from scratch each time. This would be like if Honda decided to would like redesign the brake pad for every single car they made instead of designing a brake pad that could be sort of applied in other vehicles. And so what we're working on, and what Sarotny Group is working on, is a way to design a system for delivery, not an individual product. And so when you focus on the system of delivery, you have something that can be iterated through successive projects. And we think that that's sort of a huge advantage. And that's the sort of the correct approach for this sort of thing that will yield some of those improvements that you see in other industries.
The artist rendering of your Victoria Park apartment complex, Freudian slip, I apologize, shows a lot of green, both on the roof and on the courtyard walls.
Yeah.
Is that just nice pictures or is that part of your plan?
Yeah, so it's part of the plan. So it might not necessarily look like that day one. So one of the advantages that we have, being the owners and operators of this building, is that this is a long-term project. And so what we want to do is have this building get better with age, not worse. But it is designed so the green roof will be there, the naturalized central courtyard will be there. Sort of the greenery that you see on the mesh, it's called the Jacoby mesh system, which is sort of the kind of the like the railings that you see, that will obviously take time to mature and grow and improve. So it's a long term strategy.
It looks like a beautiful project. Good luck on that. It's under construction right now.
It will be at the end of the year
And
if
when
all, if
is
all, if all goes well.
when's planned opening date?
So if construction starts end of the year. It's a 22-month construction period. So yeah.
So if
So
people
I
want to
think
get on the list to rent an apartment, can they do that yet?
we're getting a waiting list going as we speak, actually. Yeah.
Where does someone sign up on the waiting list? Because the place looks spectacular.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we're really excited. So if they go to our website, wellgroundedrealestate.com, they'll see this project there, and they can click on it for more information, or to get on a waiting list at some point soon.
And when you price the rents, do you price it sort of on a bedroom basis or on a square foot basis, or what's sort of the comparable ratio you use?
So we do it on a per bedroom basis. Well, per unit basis. Simply because that's sort of how the market interprets this. So, a lot of the sales figures are sort of per square foot, but when you go to market, people always ask, well, what does this mean for monthly rent? So this is how we think of it. This is how we price it. We compute rent per square foot just to understand sort of where we're sitting after the fact, but we don't start there.
And so what would a one bedroom go for, do you think?
So we're pricing them at about $2,400.
And what would that be on a per square foot basis?
About $4. I think $4.05 or so.
And what's the size of a one bedroom now?
They range in that building, I believe it's between 550 and 600, something like this.
I was told that condo sizes for the same number of bedrooms are smaller than rental. Is
Hmm.
that the case, do you think?
I don't know offhand, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Why?
Again, apartment buildings have sort of there's a different model. It's more long term. So if you have a developer that is building a product that they're going to own and operate into perpetuity, um, every decision they make, for better or worse, is going to be on them. And so if you're releasing these units throughout the course of the building's lifetime, I think you're going to be more conscious of size or any of these long-term factors that might affect, or perhaps people are building for families. So any of these could be, possible reasons.
I was told that the reason why is in the condo business, you build a unit for someone who's trying to figure out how much money they can make. But in the rental business, you're building a unit for someone who's trying to figure out if they want to live there.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. That might track.
We're going to take a break for some messages. We'll be back with Jonathan in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're talking about apartment buildings, rental apartment buildings today with Jonathan Diamond, who's a principal at Well Grounded Real Estate. He's head of acquisitions and head of finance at this family-owned company. And we've been talking a little bit about why there hasn't been more rental accommodation built. When I've complained about that or commented about that in the past, Jonathan, the comeback that I get is, well, there actually has been a lot of rental. It's just been condos that have been built and sold to investors that then turn around and rent it. And that is the case because I think a lot of these investor-owned condos are rented out in the marketplace, are they not?
They are. So they refer to that as the secondary market. And I mean, certainly that's a factor. But from the user's perspective, it's a completely different experience.
Tell me
So
about
one of
that.
the
How's the experience
yes,
different?
yeah. So I mean, one of the things that the condo, or sorry, the sort of the purpose-built rental operator has going for them is that they're operating this building as a business. They have professional management in case. Companies like Fitzrovia, for example, will have sort of coffee shops that are built in, and they're doing daycares now, and it's more of like a full service amenity package. Whereas if you're leasing a condo unit off, just an individual, they may have very little experience with property management and all of these things. So I think that sort of translates to the ultimate rental experience.
From a societal standpoint, do you think it matters whether it's a secondary market rental or a purpose-built rental?
It's a very good question. It's definitely less transparent. So there, I know a lot of the sort of stats platforms have trouble getting information about sort of how large is this secondary market. Um, I mean, I think any units that come online that are being used, be it for investments, rental, or for owner occupancy, I think are helpful. So I certainly have nothing against it. The only point I wanted to make was really just to highlight the two different possible experiences for the end user.
With the condo business right now, the cash flow, CIBC came out with a big report, I guess a week ago, saying 81% of condo owners that were renting were cash flow negative, such that they weren't covering their costs. If those investors aren't covering their costs, how can you cover your costs?
It's a very good question. So, I mean, it's kind of comparing apples and oranges because, I mean, first of all, their mortgage rates would be at completely different levels than we're borrowing at. We'll borrow at like sort of commercial rates that are based on the some spread against the Canada mortgage bond, maybe 40 basis points or something like that, whereas the residential loans are probably 100 basis points higher. Um, and so that's certainly a factor. They're also not diversified. Assuming you have one or two units, it's very different from having a full set of a full building. When you're running the business, as I sort of mentioned before, is you have a huge sort of distribution of rents. We're a very low leverage company, so the assets that do have debt is very modest. So there's sort of a few difference to compare and contrast those two situations.
In the condo, they've got to pick up all that common area maintenance charges. How do you pick that up? That's got to be in your rent effectively, correct?
Yep, yep. So that's just an expense for us. So we take in unit rent and we take in rent from parking spaces, and that's effectively it. A little bit of rent from laundry, and then we pay our bills. And the bills would be everything from realty taxes, mortgages expense, all of the repair and maintenance. So that sort of gets put into that bucket.
I was told that the management of and the efficiency of managing all those extra expenses is far better with a professional management of a purpose-built rental than it would be with a condo board and a condominium association. What do you think about that?
I think that's right. I mean, as I said, I don't, I've never been on a condo board. We don't deal with condos, but I speak to this with my brother all the time. We always ask how they make decisions. Like if they're doing some sort of complex elevator overhaul or a roof replacement, how are they actually making these decisions when they might not have some sort of expert on staff? So it's a great question. I wonder the same thing.
From a societal standpoint, some people made the argument that the lack of rental availability and the sort of the over focus on home ownership, whether it be single family homes or townhomes or condos, means that our labor force is less mobile.
Hmm.
Now, you were making the argument that if you've got a rent controlled unit, you don't want to move. And so therefore, maybe my argument doesn't hold water. But from a societal standpoint, from a labor force mobility standpoint, is having a reasonable amount of rental accommodation actually helpful?
I think so. I mean, I think what you want to do as a society is you want to have options for people. And so you want there to be available super fancy rental and entry level rental and super fancy monster homes and townhouses and cheaper bungalows and missing middle housing. You sort of want a variety of options so that the consumer can decide. So I think that's what we want to strive for. We want to have a sort of a healthy, balanced marketplace that is delivering asset classes of all sort of shapes and sizes and price points, so that people can search out what they're interested in living in.
You mentioned missing middle. You're not in the construction of missing middle homes, are you?
Depends how you define it. So I was at a conference that was called Missing Middle, and they were talking a lot about sort of laneway housing. But I would also describe missing middle as everything up to sort of like mid-rise, like kind of 10 stories. So, in that sense, we are. So we have a small townhouse development on Keel Street that's an infill project that I guess could be classified as that. And our Victoria Park project, although it's 12 stories, it's 185 units. It, in some sense, might be missing middle in that it's not a high-rise building. So, depends how you classify these.
Some people have argued that we do single family homes well. We do, buildings that are, whether they're 10 stories or 20 to 50 stories, I don't know, but mid-rise to high-rise well, but we don't do missing middle well. And that we've got a whole bunch of zoning regulations that restrict the ability to do missing middle, and that's where a lot of people, whether they be seniors that are downsizing or people that are just starting out, or people that have got less income, want to actually live. What do you think about that?
I think it's 100% right, but I think the follow-up question is, well, why? And you might say, well, people just want to build high density condominiums. And what I would argue is that this is what the market selects for. So if we use sort of an evolutionary analogy from sort of like evolutionary biology, the product that survives in the economic climate and the development sort of system that we've evolved, which encompasses all of the rules and regulation and taxes and zoning bylaws and all of these sorts of things, the things that can sustain itself are high density condominiums, which is why you don't see the low density apartments. So that's sort of what I would say to that is we've created a structure where a very limited number of asset classes can survive.
Why? Why have we created that structure?
That I don't know, but I know what it's a result of. It's a result of massive uh, regulation, for sure. Things like angular planes, lengthy zoning processes that cost a lot. So if a project that is 100 units that's classified as missing middle takes as long and costs as much to get approved as something that's 50 stories, the developer is going to allocate capital to the 50-story project because it makes more economic sense. And so what you have is this sort of linear or sort of this sort of non-changing workload, but you also have this like the profitability goes up, and so you're not going to create something that costs as much and not make as much. You're going to spend that time and build something really, really tall.
Some people, some politicians don't believe that they've got an overly burdensome regulatory framework and or that they can't change it. Would you say to that?
I mean, I mean, I disagree with that. I mean, I think that, I mean, look, there's a lot of, the question is, what is regulation for? I think this is where you have to start. And you want to increase public safety, right? You want buildings that aren't going to collapse. You want buildings that are safe. You want buildings that are, have the right turning radiuses for cars. You want the right pickup system. We want to understand whether our municipal sewer system can actually handle the waste. Like all of these are really practical regulation, but all regulation is costly and adds time. And so the question is, well, what are you getting for that? And this is what every politician needs to after. So they have to say, given a regulation, given the fact that it takes things, it adds time and cost to projects, what are we getting for it? And if the answer is not much, then it should be removed. If the answer is some sort of societal benefit, it should be kept. That's how I
Well, and
sort of
what
think
you're
about
saying
this.
is what we're getting from it is the only thing that makes economic sense is really tall buildings and really small unit size.
Yeah, we've designed a system that makes missing middle apartments almost impossible.
That's fascinating and interesting. In the United States, there's a big trend to institutions, companies buying lots of single family homes and renting them out. But that really hasn't come to Canada yet. What do you think it will?
It's a good question. I mean, the United States is such a bigger market compared to what we have here. So I think I'm not even sure if there's the opportunity that here that is there. Time will tell, I guess.
Explain to everyone what an angular plane is that you mentioned a couple minutes ago.
Yeah. So an angular plane is the sort of they call it the wedding cake model, where you've got a building instead of it going straight up like a rectangular box, it will sort of go up and then it will angle as if somebody like took a knife to it and sliced off the corner. And so if you picture that image and then you picture the image that could have been, which is a straight box, you've effectively limited the number of units that that building could have easily had. They've done this for the mid-rise guidelines, I believe, having to do with sort of sun exposure and shadows. But at the end of the day, it creates really, really ugly and expensive topologies because like the plumbing systems and the electrical, it makes the design and the construction more expensive. I think they don't look all that great. And it also created it prevented more units from being built in a given project.
Doesn't make any sense.
Not to me, but I could be missing something.
So, this focus on shadows that some people think is critically important and other people think is a little bit silly. That creates this need for this residential proximity slope or angular plane. Do you think it makes any sense?
Within reason. I mean, I agree that, if you have some, amazing playground and you created development that casts like a permanent shadow on it, that's, something to be avoided. But we've been in community planning meetings where we've had neighbors complaining that she grows tomatoes in her backyard and she's concerned about the shadows. And so I think that there's like the practical and then there's the extreme. And I think the extreme makes no sense. Some sort of edge cases that create sort of really dark, dingy sections of the city. Totally fair argument that can be debated. But yeah, this idea that like all shadows are bad, full stop, isn't so practical.
I was out walking around downtown Toronto and everyone was looking for shade. It was so
Yeah.
hot and sunny.
Yep. That's the other thing. Yep.
And in all the sunny places, where people were sitting?
Where?
Under umbrellas.
Right. Yeah. There you
So
go.
I think that this over focus. I'm developing a building in Dallas, and they have this residential proximity slope, angular plane concept. But then, right away, people want to build tons of umbrellas, and they want to build sheds for all the cars because the cars can't handle
Yeah.
the sun. And the biggest concern is melanoma, and so many people are now getting it after getting way too much sun as a kid, and it takes, like, from what I understand, 30, 40 years of time to come to fruition. I think it's a silly. The other one that I want to understand is fire escapes. There's been big controversy about fire escapes recently. Tell me
Mhm.
about that. Not fire escapes, but stairways.
Yeah, so there's this big sort of push for single stair buildings, which are sort of, as the name suggests, are buildings that have a single stair. So Canada has one of the most restrictive building codes with respect to this this topology. So I believe we can't build more than 3 stories with a single stair. So when you go up and you build, say, a 5-story unit, a 5-story building, what that means is you have to have 2 exit stairways that are joined by a hallway. So effectively, what this means is that more of the floor plate is taken up by non-sellable or leasable square footage, which would be the hallway and 2 stairwells, which again makes these smaller mid-rise projects less economical. So there's been a huge push to demonstrate that single stair buildings are not any less safe than their dual stair counterparts, and that the building code should be adjusted so that you could build larger buildings with this single stairwell.
I'm told that when the requirements for 2 stairs was put in place, it may have made sense given the building materials and fire sort of standards at the time. But given building materials, building processes, fire standards, etc., today, it no longer makes any sense. But we haven't changed the standard.
Yeah, totally agree. So, at the time, buildings were super flammable and the fire department wasn't, super advanced. And so, sure, that made sense. Again, this would be presumably an example of policy that had some sort of societal good, but it is up to us to evaluate these policies to make sure that they continue applying society good. And in this case, I think there's some very, very good arguments that this policy is doing more harm than good, especially when it comes to sort of affordability and sort of very efficient housing topologies for this smaller scale.
Jonathan, this has been really interesting. We're going to take a final break and come back. And when we come back, I'm going to ask you, if miraculously I made you Minister of Housing, what would you do? Stay with us, everyone. We're back in 2 minutes with some final concluding comments. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Today, we're talking about the rental apartment sector of the real estate business in the Greater Toronto Area. My guest is Jonathan Diamond, and it's been interesting because earlier in the week we've had people talking about the economics of housing and the reality of the condo business. So, Jonathan, I want to ask you, if I made you Minister of Housing, or not me, someone else made you Minister of Housing tomorrow, what would you do? What would be your strategy to solve, these housing problems that we've got right now in the Greater Toronto Area?
It's a loaded question. I have some ideas. I think some of them I've alluded to already during this conversation. I think first and foremost, I would take every zoning and site plan requirement and evaluate them for their efficacy, and just ask a simple question: does this make buildings worse, or does this make buildings better? And I would filter the regulation using that question. And then the other thing, I would do the same thing to fees. So I am not a big fan of incentives, because things that need to be incentivized are typically things that don't happen naturally. And I'm a big advocate of having things happen naturally. And so I would focus much more attention on removing barriers than adding incentives.
Okay. Sounds like a good process. What about anything else to induce more rental housing?
Yeah, I mean, I think zoning, like improved zoning regulation and cost structures would make things more affordable based on more efficient built forms, and also fewer fees to realize the type of housing that we were talking about in the building, which is sort of capturing this vibrant middle market that is yet to be served by rental developers.
There's been a big desire for, affordable, like deep affordable, almost social housing. Can that be done without incentives, without government giving land or contributing somehow?
So it depends. It depends. So there's absolutely a role for government there to fill um, a need that is not fulfilled by the private industry. But I would 100% put the onus on the private industry to fill that role. So the way affordable housing is done now is it's effectively mandated. And my concern is that if we run this process over time, you're going to have units that are regulated or deemed as affordable from the top down on one end of the spectrum, and you're going to have price escalations on the sort of the unregulated units on the other end of the spectrum. You're going to get this sort of bifurcation in the market. I'm very, very concerned about that. I would much rather a situation emerge that makes building lower rent housing profitable, in the same way that again, go back to this car analogy, whereas, building a Honda Civic serves a very different market than building a Porsche 911.
John, this has been a really interesting conversation. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos are available on my website, briancrombie.com. And all of my shows go on podcast servers as well as social media, including YouTube, as soon as the radio show goes to air. We've had an interesting series this week where we've had an economic-oriented discussion of the condo crisis. Someone called the Condo Queen of pre-construction condos talk about what's actually happening in the marketplace today. We've had Jonathan talk about the apartment complex, and tomorrow we're going to talk about competitiveness and how this all impacts Canadian competitiveness. So please join us. A great series of conversations this week. Thank you very much. Good night, Jonathan.
Good night.